Welcome, everyone. I'm Benjamin Suarez from the Center for Global Islamic Studies here at UF, and this event this evening is one of many events that we organize during the academic year. We have two more events coming up this month. We have a film screening on April 17th about Muslim youth in the U.S., and we also have a lecture on April 24th by Professor Faisal Devji from the University of Oxford, and he will be talking about ISIS, the Islamic State, and that's on the 24th of April. I will now pass the microphone to my colleague Mustafa Ahmed, who is from the faculty, the College of Medicine, and he is a member of the advisory board of the Center for Global Islamic Studies, and he has been involved in organizing other events with the Graham Center. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to our discussion this evening, Hate and Understanding in an Era of Polarization. As Dr. Suarez mentioned, this is a collaborative event between the Center for Global Islamic Studies as well as the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. Just a few comments, please. If you don't mind to silence your phone. Tonight's proceedings are being recorded, as well as live stream. That's where everybody else is right now. And so, we have a very challenging and unfortunately necessary conversation of how do we navigate this seemingly increasing hateful rhetoric and hateful actions within our country. And to help us understand that, we have two experts that are going to take us through the history of the hate industry and then utilize the American Muslim community as a case example as to how that may manifest itself and how misunderstandings can be utilized to drive fear and the consequences that that has. And then at the end of this discussion, talk about some examples of coalition building and how can we change the structure of our society to overcome some of these barriers and overcome hate and build understanding. So to help us along this process, we have Alejandro Beutel from the Southern Poverty Law Center, where he is a senior research analyst. Specifically, he works in the Intelligence Project, monitoring far-right extremist and hate groups. And he is the lead of the desk that monitors anti-Muslim hate groups. Alejandro has his master's degree in public policy from the University of Maryland and has also worked with various think tanks and research organizations in the past. And he's joined by Meira Neggaz, who is the executive director for the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which is a nonprofit think tank and research organization which focuses on actionable research for the American Muslim community. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to our presenters. Just to let everyone know, we are going to have an open Q&A session at the end. So if you have questions for either Alejandro or Meira, please reserve them for the end, and then I'll find you with the microphone. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Alejandro Beutel, and again, thank you all for coming here today, and thanks to the University of Florida, the Bob Graham Center, and the Global Center for Islamic Studies. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here today. Just a couple of quick caveats here, just two things really quickly. One is that thankfully I have Meira here who, in addition to my co-panelist, has graciously agreed to keep track of my time. Prior to coming to SPLC, I used to work at the University of Maryland. And so basically the way that I like to think of myself is as a recovering academic who's now returned to advocacy. And so like many academics, I have a tendency to sort of talk on and on and on and maybe get lost in certain points. So hopefully Meira will make sure to keep me on point on that. And so what I will do as a guard against that as well is, in addition to Meira's graciousness, is I'll sort of state some of my summary points up front so that in case I do run out of time, at least that the main points will be there. The second thing is just that if I have a moment where I need to collect my thoughts, just please forgive me. The holy month of Ramadan is about a month and a half away, and so I've started to engage in some practice fasts, including today. And so I might be just a little bit dulled at the edges today, more than usual, but nothing too serious. So that said, welcome, and let us begin. So again, what I want to basically talk about is an overview of the U.S. anti-Muslim hate movement. And again, I'm a senior research analyst at the Intelligence Project, so I focus on two areas. I'm not the head of the anti-Muslim desk, although I am very active in the anti-Muslim desk that's there. And in addition to that, I also monitor a lot of the far-right anti-government extremist groups, such as like militia movements or sovereign citizens, armed individuals who may engage in paramilitary exercises and the like. And so what I'm sort of want to discuss in terms of the key takeaways, again, because I just want to make sure to be concise with my time here, is just sort of four things here. Generally, people say you should bring in three things, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to sneak in at least one more thing. And so the four key things that I want people to sort of take away with here for a moment is that when we look at the objective of the organized anti-Muslim hate movement, organized in the sense that there are actual groups of individuals who work and coordinate together to push anti-Muslim hatred, their overall objective, what they share in common, is an attempt to demonize, otherize, and marginalize Muslims. And in the most extreme cases, potentially criminalize some of their actions altogether. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But again, demonize, otherize, and marginalize altogether to keep Muslims at the fringes of American political and civic and social life. The second key takeaway that I want people to understand about the nature of anti-Muslim bigotry itself is that in ways, oftentimes people think of it as sort of like this, it's its own standalone sort of an issue. But in fact, anti-Muslim hate and bigotry is actually connected to bigotry and hatred directed at other groups of people throughout history and ongoing as well. And in the way that it functions, oftentimes, is that it's not just that it's explicitly directed at a particular defined group of people, in this case Muslims, but oftentimes it will use code words and structures that will then be directed at other groups of people based on their race, based on their faith, based on other sorts of things. And you will see history sort of repeating itself over and over and over again. It's interesting, just as a quick anecdote and aside. So as I mentioned before, I'm fasting right now for Ramadan. That's the giveaway. I'm Muslim, right? And you would think to yourself, who the heck is this guy, Alejandro Beutel? Spanish first name, German last name, pronounced actually Beutel. And he's Muslim coming up here talking about this sort of stuff. Funny thing is that so I am half Italian and half Salvadorian. And actually, my father is Jewish and my mother is Catholic, and then there's me. So we got all three religions in the family. By the way, happy Easter and Pesach Sameach to our Jewish and Christian brethren here. But the interesting thing that my father told me when he was, looking at this, we had this conversation about a year and a half ago, and he said to me, Alejandro, I'm really concerned about you because you are so open with the fact that you're a Muslim. And I was like, why? And he's like, look, I grew up as a Jew in the American Southwest in Arizona. And I grew up where I used to literally walk by country clubs where the signs posted up there would say, no Jews, blacks, Mexicans, and dogs allowed. And the thing that concerns me is that as a person who grew up in that generation, as the son of a Holocaust survivor, and you as a grandson of a Holocaust survivor, is that I'm hearing some echoes of that history again. Damn. Like, that really took me back, hearing that from my own father for a moment there. And so I just share that anecdote because it's sort of a very personal example of what I'm hoping will be sort of a broader sort of academic context here today. Again, advocate, but still recovering academic here at a university. So I'm going to sort of tease out the nuances on that a little bit. And then, of course, the third takeaway is that anti-Muslim hate is a lucrative industry. People profit off of this sort of exploitation of fear and misunderstanding of a group of people, both financially and politically. There are some very interesting sort of empirical associations, including my colleague here up on the dais with me, who will probably talk about some of her own findings, which I'm hoping will be uncovered a little bit more. And the way that some of this hate manifests itself in terms of things is not just through rhetoric, but in other forms like frivolous legislation at the state level. You'll see hate crimes that have had a consistent uptick in the past 18 months, election outcomes, and of course attitudes, people's attitudes and understanding towards Muslims, which again my colleague here will really sort of unpack further. So I won't get into too much about what SPLC is and whatnot. Basically, we're a civil rights organization. We have a three-pronged mission. The way that I like to talk about it is we litigate, educate, and investigate. We try to take on groups like the Klan and neo-Nazis to bankrupt them and make sure that they literally don't have the funds to carry out their hate. That's even what we've been doing with a lot of trying to bankrupt them online with Bitcoin and other things like that. We educate. We have our Teaching Tolerance program, which basically is out there to give educators in K through 12 settings the sort of tools and curriculum they need to help raise the next generation of citizens in our country that will espouse and live up to the pluralistic values that make and define our country. And of course, there's the investigation and research. That's where we come in to constantly monitor and maintain vigilance against hate groups, because even if the civil rights movement marches on, even if, to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., the great reverend, that the moral arc of history bends towards justice, there are people who are going to march in the opposite direction. There are always people who are going to try and engage in a counter-gravitational pull against that moral arc. And we need to be there vigilant against that. That's what we try to do here. That's what we do at the Intelligence Project with that. We monitor a whole array of hate groups. Last year in 2017, we counted about 954 different hate groups across various movements. They're all sort of listed up there. What I cover, as mentioned up there, is in the nativism section there that looks at anti-immigrant and, in my case specifically, anti-Muslim. And then, of course, there's anti-government extremist groups that we have up there as well, 689. I look at all of these different groups with a number of my colleagues as well on the Patriot desk. So what is anti-Muslim hate? The really sort of quick deep dive into it is simply a vilification of Islam and Muslims and an exaggerated fear of Islam and Muslims. Some people like to use the term Islamophobia. This sort of phenomenon is nothing new. It has been around for very, very long decades and centuries even. You had individuals such as Professor Kidd, trying to remember, I think it was not Case Western University, but Baylor, who's a professor of evangelical history out there, himself a very devout individual, but also a very erudite historian, though, who looked at sort of the early American engagement with Christianity and gave a very nuanced take on it. But one of the interesting things that he did point out was that in this very nuanced engagement and varied engagement with American Christianity was that there has been a long period in history of vilification that's taken place even among a lot of the literature that was around and prevalent and circulating prior to the independence of the United States, and then even afterwards. Of course, this is complicated and checkered by the fact that the very first country to recognize the United States was the Sultanate of Morocco, right? And so history is a very complicated, sort of messy sort of thing. But nonetheless, for our purposes here, it's also important to understand, though, that this phenomenon is nothing new. That said, what is new is, especially post 9/11, that this kind of sort of fear and otherization of a particular group of people based on their religious tradition has now organized itself into a particular movement. That's sort of where the newness sort of comes in. But the actual underlying sort of fear and bias that's there, though, is not per se. And again, as I've mentioned before, anti-Muslim hate is in many ways sort of intertwined with other sort of fears and bigotries that have been cast upon other groups of people. And in that way, then it operates as both an explicit and coded form of bigotry. When I say coded form, by the way, do people know exactly what I'm saying? Does anyone have any sort of idea? Let me just break that down really quickly. coded form of bigotry in many cases, to give one example, would be that, for instance, there are some people, for instance, that when certain words are used, like welfare queens or illegal immigrants or things like that, oftentimes on its face, it may be talking about people who exploit the welfare system or people who have come into this country without the proper documentation and such. But for many people who may have certain racial anxieties or fears about particular groups of people, what they're hearing are, oh, African Americans, or or Hispanics, or in many cases nowadays when people talk about terrorism, they're thinking about Muslims. The interesting thing is that when talking about or using even Muslim as a slur, is that, to give one example, with in the 2008 election, when Barack Obama was running for the first time as the candidate for the president of the United States, people were literally using the slur, calling him as a slur a Muslim, a secret Muslim. And what's so interesting, just to sort of give an anecdotal analysis, and of course there's all kinds of other statistical and empirical research to back this, but to give a very quick anecdote that sort of encapsulates this is, for instance, I was giving a talk a few years ago back in Maryland about sort of various forms of hate and bigotry back in the day when I was an academic. And there was a gentleman there who was African American and Muslim, and like my father was also present in this room. And the African American, gentleman, Muslim gentleman, came up, gave a comment, and he was talking about various things. But one of the most interesting things that he said was, oftentimes the people who are calling then candidate Obama a Muslim it was a code word for other things that they wouldn't otherwise say. And what he said essentially was, they call him the M word because they can't call him the N word. Okay? And so this is a good example then in terms of how anti-Muslim hate in many ways functions then in this very double-edged, nasty, negative way of both being an explicit form of bigotry, but also a coded form of bigotry as well. Thank you. Indefatigable as always. Thank you, Meira. And so when we're talking about anti-Muslim bigotry as sort of having connections to other forms of paranoias and extremisms and hate, I just want to give like two very prominent narratives that have been repeated over and over and over and over again, whether I have heard it as a professional analyst or even when I've experienced it personally myself at times. The first one is what I would call sort of the narrative of the Muslim as a fifth column. And in many ways, this sort of harkens back to, everyone probably remembers the Red Scare of the 1950s, and people have learned about McCarthyism and whatnot, right? Sort of almost the idea and the notion of the communist boogeyman, and that communism is everywhere, it's infiltrating. In some ways, people even used communist oftentimes as a code word for Jew. Okay, my father also remembers this very vividly growing up. But so communism itself, there was this political paranoia about communism. The communists were infiltrating our society. There were members of members of Congress who were communists, members of Hollywood who were communists. So it was just pervading everywhere. And so oftentimes then part of the narrative was that the people who were being accused of being communists were then seeking to basically undermine America's social values, undermine its, replace the Constitution then with a totalitarian sort of a system. And so a similar narrative is being placed, but you replace the word, or at play, replace the word communist with Muslim, and what you're often hearing now is Muslims want to replace the Constitution not with communism but with Sharia law. Okay? In other words, Sharia, which is just sort of a religious personal code of ethics, if you will, or personal set of principles, how you pray, how you fast, like what I'm doing right now, making the sacred pilgrimage, who you give charity to, those kinds of things. But this is interpreted by other people as, oh, this is a sort of very theocratic system that Muslims are using, or at least a prominent subsect of Muslims are using then to hopefully conspire and overthrow the United States government. And again, this is sort of a throwback then to a lot of that sort of earlier paranoia that's out there. Another sort of common one is sort of the notion of how Muslim immigrants and more recently Muslim refugees who are trying to enter the United States and flee from war-torn areas are now also being cast as sort of like this invasion or this demographic threat. In Europe, a term that's very common that you may hear or may have heard is the notion of Eurabia. Guess what you think that they're trying to sort of get at with that sort of connotation there, right? Or in other cases, some people are now referring to Sweden as Swedenstan and other sort of very derogatory terms, or Londonistan in other cases for specific cities. Some of us are laughing and chuckling in the back because it's like, yes, we've heard this again for how many times now? The millionth time. If I only had a penny, I would be a rich man. Within this sort of narrative, then, you will hear stories, either exaggerated or, quite frankly, in many cases fabricated, of sexual assault and rape. It is not uncommon to hear the term being thrown around of rape-fugee. This is not uncommon in terms of how, and I'm especially sort of sensitive to this as someone of Latin American descent, and again, as someone working for a civil rights organization, of how oftentimes many undocumented immigrants, particularly coming from Latin America, are talked about as well as that there are these rapes, or that they're gang members, or that they're violent individuals. They bring crime and drugs and disease in. And so these sorts of things are repeating themselves over and over and over again. And in many cases, you have some people then who are also saying, well, bringing in Muslims or bringing in immigrants or bringing in refugees, whether it's in Europe or here into the United States, is fundamentally changing the character of America, and that it's making these demographic changes. These fears, these narratives are repeating themselves over and over and over again, and you hear them commonly perhaps in anti-immigrant or sometimes in white nationalist movements, but if you just replace certain words or certain targeted peoples, now you're also hearing this within the anti-Muslim movement as well. The parallels are very hard to overlook. 5 minutes left, you said, right? So with sort of just the remaining time, I just want to very quickly sort of note again here, what are some of the manifestations and effects that we see here? One example is sort of frivolous, what I would call frivolous legislation, right? We all know like frivolous lawsuits, things that are just not meant to be effective or tie up the courts. Well, there's frivolous legislation that's out there as well. A good example are what are known as anti-Sharia, sometimes also called anti-foreign law bills. And what they essentially do is claim to outlaw Sharia. They claim to outlaw what is often otherwise called sometimes foreign law. There's this, the justification that is often used is we don't want foreign law replacing the U.S. Constitution or American law. The problem is that pretty much almost every single legal expert outside of the anti-Muslim movement has basically said this is absolutely ridiculous. You have the supremacy clause within the U.S. Constitution that literally says the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. End of story. So for any group to try and pass legislation that would then try and basically replace the Constitution with Sharia law is absolutely absurd altogether. And so the whole purpose of these laws being introduced and attempted to being passed is not to create public policy, but to shift public perception. The very author of the template of these kinds of bills, David Yerushalmi, who is a very prominent activist within this movement, has himself literally said the whole purpose of this is not to pass legislation, but to create a heuristic and get people asking, what is Sharia? That is a direct quote from the man himself. So again, this is not about public policy, but about creating perception. Going back to what I said before, the overall objective, otherizing, demonizing, vilifying, marginalizing, Muslims in the United States. That's the overall sort of objective. Could talk about hate crimes a little bit later. The only other thing that I'll sort of mention quickly is the profiteering from hate. I would note that it takes generally two forms. There's political profiteering and then financial profiteering. You have had research organizations such as the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. that have noted, for instance, that just between 2008 and 2011, this was a very narrow study with a very conservative estimate, but they tallied that what they dubbed the Islamophobia industry, or what I'll call the anti-Muslim hate industry, basically netted around $42 million. And they looked at only about a handful of organizations that were out there. $42 million, handful of organizations, 3-year period. People are making a lot of sort of money off of this. There are people who are constantly churning out books, putting out book deals there. One of the most prolific anti-Muslim authors that's out there, Robert Spencer, has had multiple New York Times bestsellers. Why? Hate pays in many ways, unfortunately. The other thing, and my colleague here will talk about this, I think, a little bit more, is, of course, the fact that anti-Muslim attitudes and the rise in anti-Muslim rhetoric is also strongly correlated around election cycles. So it's not that terrorist attacks per se are what actually create the rise in reported anti-Muslim attitudes through polling and such. It actually correlates much more around election cycles instead. And so what this shows is that you have politicians and other sort of national figures who are trying to use this as an opportunity to sort of politically uplift themselves and tap into people's underlying misunderstandings and fears about Muslims. The wrinkle is that while this has been sort of a consistent trend over the past several election cycles, with the 2016 election cycle, what's happened now actually is that there's been a polarization, which actually speaks to today's sort of title of this event, in the sense that people are now dubbing this dynamic a Trump effect, where you have the polarization going in two ways now. You have some people who identify themselves as political conservatives who are deepening their anxieties towards Muslims, but you have people who identify as independents and political liberals who are shifting in the opposite direction and actually having improved or more positive attitudes towards Islam and Muslims. And so what's happening as of late is that there's been this polarization now of how anti-Muslim hate is working out attitudinally. So the last thing I just want to, again, sort of remind people is, and hit home with this, is just sort of a visual here. Again, even out of the 4 takeaways, if there was one takeaway that I want people to come away with, is that anti-Muslim hate is not a Muslim problem. It is a challenge for all Americans to beat back altogether. It is not just a hate that is directed at one group of people. It is ultimately a threat to American society in general, just as any other form of hate is. And it overlaps with other forms of extremism and hate. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just look at what's up here, for instance. And I just want to explain these 4 sort of pictures here. The one in the top left is basically a screenshot from Stormfront, which is a popular neo-Nazi website. And basically, this was Billy Roper, who was a very sort of high-profile neo-Nazi agitator who had basically volunteered to organize an anti-Muslim demonstration in Arkansas itself. And so SPLC, which regularly monitors these sorts of forums and these kinds of hate movements, actually saw Billy Roper, a neo-Nazi, organizing on behalf of one of the most prominent anti-Muslim organizations in the United States, Act for America. In the top right corner, you have the Twitter account of Nathan D'Amigo, who used to be the former head of Identity Europa, which again is another white nationalist organization. That's a photo of him out in California attending one of these so-called anti-Sharia, read anti-Muslim rallies that's there. In the bottom left corner is, again, another group that had attended a similar type of anti-Sharia rally that was held that same day, but in a different location in Atlanta, Georgia. That was a group known as the Georgia Security Force 3%ers, a militia extremist group. And then, of course, in the bottom right corner is David Petty's, who is the head of a Denver chapter of Act for America. And what he's doing is literally posting a comment, getting in more information, expressing his interest on a white nationalist website, a white nationalist publication known as Countercurrents, asking if he can publish or if he can purchase a book that is written by one of the most well-known white nationalist authors in Europe itself, one of his most famous books, The Colonization of Europe. Just 4 sort of examples and illustrations up there. Reminder as a visual there of how this is all interconnected and how this overlaps. So I know, again, I probably ran over with a little bit of time, but thank you all again. Appreciate your time and consideration.
Thank you so much. I always learn something listening to Alejandro, even though I've heard him speak a million times. It's always really interesting. So thank you so much. I am going to also time check myself so I don't go over. So I am going to talk a little bit about what the effect of all of this that he talked about is on the Muslim community itself. So, you know, you hear about these hate groups, you hear sort of structural institutionalized Islamophobic groups, but how does that actually affect the community they're targeting, right? So the things I'm going to present to you, I'm drawing from a lot of our research. Some of it is available in the back if you're interested in picking up some of the data graphs. So, because I'm going to go through quickly. So the first thing I want to just point out, and Alejandro talked a little bit about these things, but I just want to highlight 3 points about demographics. So we talk a lot about American Muslims or Muslims in America, but who are they? Like, what is this group? Muslims are not a monolith. They're actually one of the most diverse communities in the entire country. Just who are they? And I think I wanted to point out 3 different things related to the demographics of the Muslim community. First is that they're very young. So nearly 40% of Muslims are under the age of 30. And that means that this anti-Muslim hate is affecting an awful lot of young people who are coming in a very, very, very difficult time. Muslims are also incredibly ethnically and racially diverse. There is no majority racial or ethnic group within the Muslim community. And so a lot of Muslims are dealing with being both Black and Muslim. They're dealing with being Latino and Muslim. They're dealing with a lot of overlapping vulnerabilities, which makes anti-Muslim hate even more challenging when you're dealing with that and other things on top of it. And the last thing I'll point out about demographics is that, there's this tendency to otherize Muslims, that they're sort of not American or, that they're other. But actually 86% of Muslims living in the United States were either born here or are naturalized American citizens. So this is completely an American problem. There's no denying that from our polling, we survey Americans every year and we pull out compared to other faith groups, compared to the non-affiliated, and compared to the general public. And there's no denying that from our polling, what we see is that Muslims disproportionately are feeling the negative effect of the current climate that we're living in. They are the most likely faith group to experience religious-based discrimination, and by quite a lot. 50% of Muslims say that they've experienced some form of religious-based discrimination in the past year. And that is, the Jewish community is the second faith community that experiences this kind of discrimination, and not to at all deny that, but as you can probably see, the Muslim community experiences quite higher levels of religious-based discrimination. And I think what's perhaps more concerning is that a lot of young children in K through 12 are experiencing bullying as a result of just being Muslim. About 42% of Muslim families say that they have at least one child that has been bullied because of their religion, and a substantial amount of kids are being bullied regularly. And I think what's more concerning, honestly, is that in a quarter of these bullying cases, an adult is involved as a perpetrator. So this is not just kids being kids. This is a much wider problem. So in a quarter of these cases, the bully was either a teacher or a school administrator. And while discrimination, some of this is a person targeting another person, whether adult or child, but this type of discrimination is unfortunately also institutionalized. I'll talk a little bit about the anti-Sharia stuff later, but one example of how anti-Muslim bigotry has been institutionalized or is structural is in the fact that Muslims are twice as likely to be stopped coming into the country. American Muslims, people who legally live here, are twice as likely to be stopped coming into the country than anybody else. And I think what's more telling about this fact is that in 7 out of 10 of these cases of Muslims being stopped for additional screening, they are visibly Muslim, right? So they have a beard, or they are wearing hijab, or whatever that visible symbol might be. These people are being pulled out and targeted because of the fact that they are visibly identifiable as being Muslim. Not surprisingly, this is pretty scary and is making people feel pretty anxious. So 40% nearly of Muslims say they feel fear for their safety or the safety of that of their families because of white supremacist movements. And Muslim women are far more fearful than Muslim men. So nearly half of Muslim women living in the United States say they are afraid for themselves and for their families. It's not really surprising then that when you ask people about their political priorities for the current government, Muslims and African Americans are the two groups that identify bigotry, racism, and discrimination and civil liberties or civil rights as a very close second to economy and jobs in terms of political priorities. As Alejandro rightly pointed out, hate is like air. It's not contained to a small area. You blow something out into the air and it permeates the entire area, and hate is very much like that, right? So one of the things, this is not from our data, this is actually from Gallup, a Gallup survey in 2010. But what they found is that the variable that was most strongly linked to prejudice towards Muslims was prejudice towards Jews. So people who self-identified as prejudiced towards Jews were 32 times more likely to also say that they were prejudiced towards Muslims. So this is not, as Alejandro mentioned, something that only Muslims need to care about. Yes, it affects the Muslim community, but we actually all need to pay attention to what is going on because it's not confined to just one group. Alejandro, just for full disclosure, used to actually work at ISPU many years ago when he was getting started, and he co-authored a really interesting and enlightening report called Manufacturing Bigotry. And what he and his co-author found, they looked at legislative efforts that were predominantly restricting or restrictive of the rights of vulnerable and marginalized communities. So they looked at things like voter ID, anti-immigration laws, anti-union measures, and one of the things in the mix was these anti-Sharia laws that Alejandro has been talking about. And basically what the found is that Muslims are often used like canaries in a coal mine. I don't know if you know that expression, but back in the day when we didn't have all this technology and people were going down into the mines, in order to test the quality of the air, they would put a canary in the front, and if the canary died, the air was toxic and people didn't go down in the mines that day, right? So in some ways, these anti-Sharia measures are being used like canaries. They're testing the waters. The legislators are testing the waters to see, can we slip through anti-immigrant or anti-Black or other measures that are predominantly affecting minority and vulnerable communities. And there was an enormous overlap. It was an 80% overlap in legislators that were proposing or sponsoring anti-Sharia laws and proposing or sponsoring other kinds of restrictive measures. So it's a very small number of lawmakers that are really doing the hate circle and targeting a lot of different groups. This is a cartoon that I highlight because, again, hate doesn't stay in one place, and it unfortunately is being recycled. Muslims are the group of the day. But 100 years ago, it was Catholics that were in a very similar situation if we're talking about religious groups. So this is a cartoon that was published 100 years ago in a mainstream magazine. And it shows crocodiles dressed in sort of Catholic robes storming the shores of the Capitol. And the sort of Protestant families protecting their children from from these dangerous Catholics. The Capitol building has a cross on top of it, so the Catholics have taken over our government. And there's a crumbling school on the hillside that nuns apparently have been teaching at and destroying our education system. 100 years ago, the same questions that are being asked, the same comments that are being thrown at Muslims, it was the same thing. Loyalty was questioned. Can Catholics be loyal to the United States and to the papacy? Is that possible? A political party sprung up, the Know Nothing Party, that was literally founded to target Catholics. And a bunch of legislation was enacted that also was specifically to restrict the rights of Catholics, to teach in schools, to fund their own organizations. So I think that's a really important and interesting cartoon. So where do we go from here? We know all this. We know that there are hundreds of hate groups that are specifically drumming up business and anti-Muslim hate. We know that it is severely affecting the Muslim community, their sense of safety, their actual safety, as we saw fleetingly in Alejandro's hate crimes statistics. So what do we do about this? Well, I want to offer a couple of points. First, I do want to point out that Muslims are not sitting around waiting to be saved by other people. Muslims have actually shown remarkable resilience over the past many years, decades, and also over the past year. So one of the things we found from our polling is that Muslims are actually being incredibly proactive at the moment. They are taking self-defense classes, Muslim women more than Muslim men. They're donating or joining or volunteering for civic organizations, many of them for the first time, 20% for the first time. And nearly 25% of Muslims have increased donations to organizations that have their best interest at heart. So, Muslims are not sitting back, they're actually taking action. For any Muslim in the room, the one thing I can implore you to do is vote. Get out and vote. Muslims are the least likely faith community to be registered to vote and the least likely faith community to actually vote. And that is a problem. People have to hold their elected officials accountable, and one of the few ways to do that is by actually voting. So that's my one tidbit for the Muslim community. For all of us, regardless of who we are, another thing that we can do is go beyond one-dimensional portrayals. Most of the time, when we see a Muslim in the news or anywhere else, and 50% roughly of Americans have never met a Muslim. So a lot of people are getting what they know from the media. Most of the time when we see Muslims in the news, it's for one of two reasons. One, there's either some threat and people are terrified, or two, they are targets and victims of Islamophobia. Those are really the only two times we ever see Muslims being talked about. But there is so much more to this community, and we should all get past that and actually talk about what Muslims are and not what they are not. So I want to give you some data points because we did this really interesting study in using Michigan as a case study. And again, there are copies in the back if anyone wants to pick one up. It's also freely available on our website, pugh.org. But we looked at the contributions of American Muslims to the health, happiness, and well-being of their fellow statesmen. So people living in Michigan, what were Muslims contributing? We have a lot of data, but I'll just point out a couple. Muslims make up less than 3% of the population of Michigan, so 2.75%. 15% of the doctors in Michigan are Muslim, and they see nearly 2 million patient visits every year. 10% of the dentists are Muslim. 10% of the pharmacists in Michigan are Muslim. 1,600 patents that were awarded over a 5-year period were awarded to Muslim-led engineering teams in the state. And Muslims contributed nearly $200 million, so $177 million to charity. And Muslims are the donations by Muslim families are 18% higher, donations to charity, than the American household average. So Muslims are far and above, sort of the average charitable giving of the United States. And 35,000 plus businesses are Muslim-owned in the state of Michigan, employing 100,000 people at least. So I think, let's talk about this stuff. Let's talk about the people who are doing this instead of these other things that keep coming up. Two more things I would highlight. Another thing you can do is break myths, bust myths. We have a lot of information and data that is very myth busting. I won't bore you with a ton of it, but I do just want to bring this one up because we talk so much about anti-Sharia measures. As Alejandro rightly mentioned, the architect of these anti-Sharia, this wave that swept the country, said explicitly that he was not there to actually stop anyone from implementing Sharia. That was never going to happen. He was there to start a conversation about Muslims, basically, and not a good one, not a positive one. So we asked people, do you favor a role for your religious law within American law? Because this threat is likely a very empty one, but we want to find out. And what we found is that Muslims and Protestants, Muslims are actually slightly less likely than Protestants to say that they favor a strong role for their religion in American law. And Muslims and Catholics are sort of closely on par. Muslims are on par with both Catholics and Protestants in terms of favoring any role for religious law in American law. So there really is no threat there, and there's certainly no difference between Muslims and Christians. The last thing I just want to mention is allyship. We all come from different backgrounds, and the one thing that we can all do is build relationships of genuine understanding, not transactional relationships, I need you, I call you, but genuine relationships. And we did a case study looking at the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing because we wanted to figure out, here's a city that was traumatized by a horrific event perpetrated by two Muslim brothers. And yet there was not a major backlash against Muslims in that city, where I happen to hail from. So I'm proud of my city for the way they responded to this awful tragedy. But we wanted to look at how is that possible after this horrible event? How did that community, how did that city avoid a terrible backlash? And what we found was the common thread. We talked to the mayor's office. We talked to Deval Patrick, who was the mayor at the time. We talked to the prosecutor's office. We talked to all of the interfaith partners, the largest Muslim the largest mosque in New England. And what everyone said, and the main reason why there wasn't a backlash, is because all of these people, including journalists, had a relationship before this tragedy hit. And they were relationships built on genuine affection and trust, so that when this awful thing happened, they were able to mobilize the synagogues, the Catholic churches, the Protestant churches, the mosques in the city, the mayor's office, the journalists, the prosecutor's office. All of these people were very quickly able to mobilize, join forces, and avoid this type of backlash. The case study is really, really interesting for anyone working in this space. Again, freely available on our website. So I think I wanted to end there and leave you all with some time to ask some questions of either myself or Alejandro. We'll do our best to answer if we can.
If anybody has any questions, I'll come around with the microphone while you guys are sort of postulating some questions. I have one for Alejandro, and that this is a problem that it's incumbent upon the citizenry to try to beat back in terms of maintaining an American democracy. But it seems like these hate groups are growing, and how can you provide an actual or actionable thing that the citizenry could do to, quote unquote, beat back the growth of the hate industry?
So there's a couple of things. I will partly agree and partly push back on the premise, and then I'll obviously make a shameless self-promotion about like resources and whatnot. But let me start with the premise there. Yes, there are groups that are growing. Certainly, there have been a lot of people who have come out of the woodwork in the past 18 months, if not even longer, energized, rightly or wrongly, by then candidate and now President Donald J. Trump. And what's interesting, however, is that a lot of these movements are actually fracturing, and they're breaking apart. Perhaps the sort of what I would call peak hate was around Charlottesville, but then after the death of Heather Heyer and just seeing the violence that had happened on the streets and whatnot, I think there was a real sort of wake-up call for a lot of people about just how serious this was. If people weren't moved earlier, even by the rise in hate crimes that were being reported several months prior to that, Charlottesville, I think, and then seeing literally 1,000 people marching and saying things like, "Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us." That very visceral face of hate, I think, really sprung people into action. As a result of it, you have situations now, though, where, for instance, SPLC has reported that, just to give you an example, one of the most, I guess you could say, effective and high-profile white nationalist, white supremacist organizations, the Traditionalist Workers' Party, formerly led by Matthew Heimbach, actually was just dismantled recently in light of the fact that we had reported on an ongoing affair and a physical altercation that had resulted from Heimbach basically sleeping with the spouse of his communication director. And so these sort of internal fighting and fraction that's taking place now has actually been happening for a while, and so SPLC and other organizations are simply reporting on the matter and bringing these issues to light, sort of in the way that Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis once said that the best disinfectant is sunlight. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do. And in many ways, part of how we've been able to do these kinds of things is the fact that we've gotten it from tips from the public. But in addition to things like that, we also, ourselves and other sister organizations like Rural Organizing Project out in Oregon, the Anti-Defamation League, even Montana Human Rights Network, they all come out with these different guides and things like that, Not in Our Town, that basically give sort of step-by-step guides for local communities on how to address incidents of hate, even hate events and things like that, and working with organizations like ISPU that provide us with evidence-based solutions. So there's a lot of good resources that are out there that people are already working towards, and I think we're already beginning to see the beginnings of a lot of pushback. It's going to take a lot more work. I don't want to be over optimistic, but but I don't want people to come away with too bleak of a picture either.
If I could just add, I think another thing that people can do just generally is just brush up on your facts. You know, follow us, follow others that bring facts into the sunlight. And when you're reading news articles, when you're hearing about what's going on, it's really helpful to just be armed with some of this background, because it helps you decipher a little bit better what you're reading and provide a little more flavor and context to the background of it. Because sometimes on the surface of these things, what you're reading may sound really reasonable, but if you understand all the things that are leading to it and some of the way that things are reported, it's a little easier for you to have a more nuanced understanding. So just get educated.
I'll just say one other really quick thing. Get to know your neighbor. Yeah. Get to know your neighbor. It is much harder to hate someone when you actually have face-to-face communication and you begin to have a human relationship with someone. Get to know your neighbor.
I wanted to ask, it appears that most of the haters, are men versus women. And have you looked into that at all? And if that is true, just was curious why.
Interestingly enough, to give you one example, for instance, much to my dismay, right, is that there are a lot of men and women that are both active. The most prominent grassroots anti-Muslim agitation group, Act for America, is actually led by a woman named Brigitte Gabriel. So, yes, sexism is a huge issue that is intertwined with all of these bigotries. But sort of the thing that I cannot downplay either as an analyst, as a professional analyst, in my assessment is there are women who exercise their moral agency in many cases through these hate movements as well. Brigitte Gabriel is the most prominent example, but you have other people like even Pamela Geller, Claire Lopez. In fact, just 2 years ago, SPLC put out a special report on the top 10 female leaders in the anti-Muslim hate movement.
But is it primarily men? I mean, when you looked at the recent march, it seems to be mostly men, no? Or
that's a hard thing to quantify. But again, what I would say is actually though that you do have large numbers of women who are involved in these movements as well, because one of the narratives about that try to cast Muslims in a negative light is that they're anti-women. And so that is used as a rallying cry oftentimes then to get more female participation in there. Think of it this way as well. For a lot of white supremacist movements, one of their rallying cries was we need to police, or what they would call protect, the bodies of white women against, for instance, men of color who would seek to sleep with them, or really what they would often say is rape them. And so oftentimes then you would have female participation in these things because that was a rallying cry to get them mobilized and involved as well.
I have a question.
It's just a historical continuity.
You mentioned bills that were oriented toward anti-Sharia. Could you just maybe explain some other proposals or bills that are being considered that address other anti-Muslim issues?
Yes, ma'am. So thank you very much, by the way, for your questions. So one example would be because anti-Sharia laws were struck down because they were so explicitly targeted at Muslims, the latest version of that, and again, this goes back to sort of coded language, was instead they moved towards anti-foreign law instead of anti-Sharia. And so what then would say is, well, we don't want foreign law sort of taking over, and then they would make references to things like the UN or other things like that, right? But again, the origins itself, the people who are pushing these kinds of things were people who had initially started off pushing these anti-Sharia bills. And often, in many cases, you would still have explicit reference, even if not in the text, then in the context where people would put out press releases or talk to media and other things like that, where you would still have legislators explicitly referencing Sharia itself. Another example might be the issue related to Andy's Law, which has been sort of like a state-level material support statute. Basically, what that just sort of does is it says, for instance, is let's say that there was a congregant who had belonged to a particular house of worship. In this case, since it's directed at Muslims, let's say it's a mosque, right? So there was a guy who frequently went to a particular mosque. He gets arrested for some sort of terrorist-related activity. This bill then goes and says that, well, we can sue that mosque because we believe that it may have been supporting that individual based on his terrorist activities, even if the linkages themselves are strung together with macaroni noodles. The purpose of that kind of law itself is not necessarily to actually win a court case, okay, because there are already existing statutes that where the evidence is ample can already convict in those cases. It's just that it's there to criminalize and basically provide a legal basis then for frivolous lawsuits that will then basically tie up these mosques and prevent them from doing things like providing services or stigmatizing them and putting them under further law enforcement scrutiny. So the effect is the same thing that's there. It is basically a solution in search of a problem.
Just to add to that, the other thing we've seen a couple of times is that there are still some anti-Catholic, there are still some laws on the books that were directed towards Catholics many, many years ago that are now being recycled and used against Muslims. So one example of that is there are laws in a couple of states where nuns were prohibited from teaching in schools if they were wearing a habit. And at least in Pennsylvania, I think there was a case brought against a Muslim woman who was wearing hijab as a teacher in a school. And so, it's new laws and it's recycling old laws to also penalize Muslims.
Just on that point, it reminded me of something back in the day from the research was that a similar law used to exist in Oregon. And what ended up happening was that part of the reason why it was repealed was that the legislator who had originally sort of back in the 1900s or late 1800s that had actually pushed that kind of a bill and got it passed through used to be a member of the KKK.
Well, on that horribly sobering note, I think that will, be respectful of the time and our partners here. I want to thank the Bob Graham Center for Public Service for giving us this venue. The speakers will be here for more one-on-one engagement. Just want to thank everyone for participating. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.